In the spring of 1815, peace had officially returned to the United States. In the Belgian city of Ghent, diplomats had signed a treaty on Christmas Eve, 1814, bringing the War of 1812 to a formal close. By February, that treaty was ratified in Washington, D.C., and the fighting between America and Great Britain was over. But on the far western frontier, in the Missouri Territory, news traveled at the speed of a horse or a canoe. Here, peace was just a rumor. Here, the war was not over. The conflict still smoldered, a dangerous ember waiting for a single spark to reignite the flames. The Battle of the Sinkhole, fought on May 24, 1815, is one of the final and most obscure skirmishes of the War of 1812. It was a battle fought 5 months after the peace, a violent, bloody postscript to a conflict that had officially ended. For the Sauk warriors involved, who had allied with the British, no official word of the treaty had reached them from their commanders. From their perspective, the war against the encroaching Americans was still very much alive. This clash exists in a liminal space between war and peace, a direct product of the era's technological and logistical limitations. Without this delay in communication, the events of that day would have been seen as a peacetime crime, not a wartime action. This information vacuum was a catalyst for violence, allowing long-simmering tensions to erupt one last time. The battle pitted two determined forces against each other. On one side were the Missouri Rangers, a territorial militia tasked with protecting the raw, violent edge of American expansion. They were settlers, farmers, and frontiersmen, neither professional soldiers nor a simple posse, but a federally authorized volunteer force organized to patrol the vast contested wilderness. On the other, a war party of Sauk and Meskwaki, led by a man whose name would echo through American history. Makai Taimeshi Kiakiak, better known as Black Hawk. A veteran of the War of 1812 and a staunch ally of the British, Black Hawk was an implacable foe of American expansion, a leader who fiercely resisted the treaties that were steadily eroding his people's homeland. This is the story of their final, forgotten battle, a clash of cultures, a tale of vengeance, and a fight for survival in a Missouri sinkhole. While the lingering state of war provided the political context for the battle, the immediate trigger was something far more personal. For Black Hawk, the fight was not just for land, it was for retribution. According to his own account, relayed years later in his autobiography, his raid into the Missouri Territory was an act of revenge. Earlier that spring, American settlers had murdered a child he had adopted. This act of violence transformed a strategic conflict into a personal vendetta, driving Black Hawk to seek justice by the only means he had on the frontier. Here, the story splits into two irreconcilable narratives. American accounts of the day, like the official report from Ranger Captain David Musick, begin with an unprovoked Sauk raid on American soldiers. They frame the subsequent battle as a defensive action against hostile aggressors. But Black Hawk's story starts earlier, with a profound loss that the American records do not mention. The absence of any American documentation of the child's murder reveals how the start of a conflict is often a matter of perspective. The historical narrative of frontier violence is frequently shaped by the records of the victors, which can omit their own provocations. To understand the bloody events of May 24th, one must begin with this unseen inciting incident, a tragedy that fueled a chieftain's rage. On the morning of May 24, 1815, Black Hawk's war party made its presence known. The first shots were fired, not in a pitched battle, but in a swift, brutal ambush near the mouth of the Couvre River. We have a vivid first-hand account of what happened from a letter written by Captain David Musick of the Missouri Rangers stationed nearby Fort Cop O'Gree. 5 men from Fort Howard were in a canoe, carrying supplies. Hidden in the bushes along the riverbank, Sauk warriors were waiting. 5 men that were detached in a canoe to convey some necessaries to the fort received a heavy fire from a party of Indians concealed in the bushes. 3 were killed dead. The 4th received a tomahawk in his head and died this morning. The 5th made his escape and was pursued to the fort. The dead were identified as Hubbard Tion, Antoine Pelkey, Francis Laramie, and George Burns. The lone survivor scrambled back to Fort Howard, raising the alarm. At the same time, Black Hawk and a single companion were positioned along the main trail, waiting. In his autobiography, he describes a different, simultaneous encounter. Shortly after, 2 men came riding on one horse. We fired, and the horse jumped, and both men fell. My comrade rushed towards them and had his scalp. I had not been long there before the man that we had wounded returned, staggering with loss of blood. This was the most terrible sight I had ever seen. I told my comrade to kill him, to put him out of his misery. In this brutal frontier warfare, Black Hawk also recounts an act of mercy. The man who initially escaped their fire, he recognized as someone who had once come to his village to teach his people how to plow. He chose to let him live, ceasing his pursuit. From Fort Howard, Captain Peter Craig led his company of about 50 rangers and regulars to the river to relieve the ambushed canoe. They charged headlong towards the Sauk warriors who had seized the boat. A party of mounted men rushed at us in full speed. I took deliberate aim and shot the man leading the party. He fell from his horse, lifeless. Captain Peter Craig was killed at the very beginning of the engagement. Ranger Alexander Giboney fell beside him. The American charge faltered, the leaderless company thrown into confusion. The sound of sustained gunfire carried 3 kilometers south to Fort Cap au Gris, a temporary post manned by another company of Missouri Rangers. The fort was also known as Fort Independence. Its commander, Captain David Music, hearing the battle, gathered 20 of his men and raced to the scene. Having arrived in good season, just on the rear of the Indians, who immediately broke and ran, I attempted to surround them, but they broke and took possession of a sinkhole where they were secure from our fire. The arrival of Music's force turned the tide. Now outnumbered by a combined force of nearly 70 Rangers, Black Hawk and his remaining 20 to 35 warriors were forced to retreat into the nearest defensible position they could find, a large, brush-filled sinkhole. The initial battle was over. The siege was about to begin. The battlefield was now defined by a single peculiar feature of the Missouri landscape, a sinkhole. This was not a simple ditch, but a product of the region's karst topography, a landscape formed by the dissolution of limestone bedrock, riddled with caves, underground streams, and depressions. For Black Hawk and his warriors, this geological anomaly became a natural fortress, a ready-made trench in the middle of the woods. The terrain itself became an active participant in the battle, neutralizing the Rangers' superior numbers and mobility, and dictating the desperate tactics that would follow. The Rangers surrounded the sinkhole, but the Sauk were well protected. The thick brush at the bottom and the steep earthen banks provided excellent cover. We were forced into a deep sinkhole. We immediately commenced digging holes in the banks of the sinkhole with our knives to protect ourselves from the enemy's fire. A tense standoff ensued. The Rangers fired down into the hole, killing one more Sauk warrior. The Sauk returned fire, killing an American who ventured too close to the edge of the pit. Some of Black Hawk's men, believing their situation hopeless, began to sing their death songs, a final cultural defiance. Frustrated by their inability to dislodge the entrenched warriors, the Rangers resorted to a desperate, inventive piece of frontier engineering. A battery or blind was hastily made on the wheels of a cart and run up to the mouth of the sinkhole, but the men could not discover an Indian. This makeshift shield, possibly with a keg of gunpowder rigged to explode, was rolled towards the edge of the sinkhole, but as it approached, a shot rang out from the brush below. Lieutenant Edward Spears, standing near the cart, was killed instantly. The Rangers behind the battery retreated, leaving Spears' body behind, deeming it certain death to all who tried to retrieve it. The bizarre contraption had failed, another victim of the sinkhole's impregnable defense. As dusk fell, the fighting subsided. Fearing Sauk reinforcements and unable to break the siege, the Missouri Rangers withdrew to Fort Howard to regroup for the night, taking their casualties with them. Under the cover of darkness, Black Hawk and his warriors slipped out of the sinkhole and escaped, melting. Under the cover of darkness, Black Hawk and his warriors slipped out of the sinkhole and escaped, melting back into the wilderness and eventually returning to their villages in Illinois. When the Rangers returned the next morning, they found the sinkhole empty, save for the body of one Sauk warrior and the American they had killed at the edge of the pit. Black Hawk describes a final, grim act of defiance. "We found one white man dead at the edge of the sinkhole, whom they did not remove for fear of our fire. We scalped him and placed our dead man upon him. We could not have left him in a better situation than on an enemy." Who won the Battle of the Sinkhole? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. The Americans held the field at the end of the day, but failed to destroy or capture their enemy. The Sauk escaped, but had been driven from the field after taking losses. The casualty reports, like the battle itself, are contradictory and reflect the fog of war. The Battle of the Sinkhole was a tactical draw, but it led to a strategic loss for Black Hawk. The following year, he was compelled to negotiate with the U.S. government, where he reaffirmed the 1804 Treaty of St. Louis, the very land cession he had fought so long and so hard to resist. This small, bloody affair in a Missouri sinkhole was a harbinger of things to come. The unresolved tensions, the clash over land, and the defiant leadership of Black Hawk would erupt again 17 years later in the much larger and more tragic Black Hawk War of 1832. The Battle of the Sinkhole, a forgotten skirmish of a forgotten war, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first violent chapter in the final, desperate struggle for the Sauk homeland.